100 photons. The distribution has become smoother. The average is now 0.279, or 28%. The probability that a photon interacts in a layer of material of given thickness is independent of how much material it has already passed through. So if half of the photons pass through an absorber of a given thickness, half of those that survived, or 1/4 of the original, will pass through 2 such layers, and so on. The attenuation of the photons is said to be exponential. I have now run a simulation in which the number of photons surviving versus distance in the sample has been recorded. And I have recorded it in the form of a graph. What we have along the x-axis is the relative distance through the phantom, and what we have on the y-axis is the fraction of the photons that have survived. We see that there are fluctuations in this. That is because I did this as a simulation and the interactions were random. We did not have precisely the same number of photons which were surviving each time. I can also plot exactly the same result on semi-log paper, and I have done that in the next scene. The semi-log paper means that the plot which I get is essentially a straight line, and again you can see that there are fluctuations of the actual number from my experiment. There are fluctuations of those numbers around that straight line. The average fraction surviving a distance x is given by e to the minus mu x, where mu is called the attenuation coefficient. For 250 kilovolt photons, the attenuation coefficient is 12.7 per meter. The fraction of the photons passing through a water phantom of thickness 1/10 of a meter is e to the minus mu x, which is e to the minus 12.7 times 0.1, or e to the minus 1.27, or 28%. A photon does not directly deposit its energy in matter. It is the energy deposited that causes some subsequent effect, such as the darkening of an X-ray film or the death of tumor cells. Any effects are caused by the charged particles, the electrons and positrons, that are produced by the photoelectric effect, the Compton scattering, or the pair production. I have now done a simulation for photons of 100 kilovolts energy, and each of the red dots represents an electron track, and therefore energy which has been transferred to electrons by the incident photons. This is a rather confusing drawing, so what I'm going to do is to change MacDose so that we only show the electron tracks. I'm going to go back again and use the same set of random numbers as before, and now we will run for 25 photons. And all we will see is the electron tracks appearing on the screen. The tracks are short, and the electron energy is absorbed close to the site where the interaction took place, and the energy was transferred to the electron. I have run a simulation, and I've kept track of how much energy is transferred to electrons by the incident photons at different depths in the phantom. And here on the screen are the results. For 4,000 photons, each of which had an energy of 100 kiloelectron volts. Again, we plot the energy transferred in each of 10 slices in the sample versus distance in the sample. And I'm now ran another simulation with exactly the same conditions, that is 4,000 photons, but they are interacting differently, and so we see that the graph of energy transferred in each slice, or energy absorbed, is slightly different. If I use photons of energy 2 million electron volts, the results are quite different. And what I'm going to do is go back to MacDose. I'm going to set my energy to be 2 million electron volts. I'm going to start with my favorite set of random numbers. I'll show the photons as well. And now I will run 25 photons. The results are quite different. The electrons are much more energetic, and they have a longer range. And in this case, they travel through many slices of the sample, and they don't just lose all of their energy at the point where they interact. The response of the tissue or the film takes place over the entire electron track. Therefore, it is necessary to distinguish between the energy transferred to electrons in a slice and the energy which is absorbed in a slice. In the shaded slice that is shown, the energy is transferred to the electrons by Compton scattering, which takes place at point C. But the electron energy is not all absorbed in that shaded slice. Much of it is absorbed as the electron continues to travel downstream and losing energy after it leaves the slice. Also, the pair production, which is shown at point P, does not contribute to the energy transferred to electrons in that shaded slice. But both the positron and the electron that were produced contribute to the energy absorbed in that slice as they travel through it. Here on the screen, we have the results of a simulation with 20,000 photons of energy 20 million electron volts each. The blue line represents the energy transferred in each slice. We can see that it falls because of attenuation going through the sample. The energy absorbed in each slice, shown by the red line, rises initially over a distance comparable to the range of each electron. Then it too begins to fall, following the energy transferred. The energy absorbed is always slightly higher in this region than the energy transferred because there was more energy transferred slightly upstream, and we're seeing the results of the finite range of those electrons. These are the actual amounts of energy transferred and absorbed. They show fluctuations from simulation to simulation. It is useful to talk about the average energy transferred per unit mass. The KERMA, which stands for the kinetic energy released per unit mass, is the average energy transferred per unit mass. The absorbed dose is the average of the energy absorbed per unit mass. So far, we have considered only the interactions of the primary photons. The secondary photon, which was produced in a Compton scattering, may also interact and produces more electrons and another photon. The third photon, in turn, may also interact, and so on down the line. We refer to all of these as subsequent interactions. What I am now going to do is to use MacDose to show you how important these subsequent interactions can be. So the first thing I need to do is to get MacDose back on the screen, and I want to run with a photon energy of 100,000 electron volts. I want to run with a particular set of random numbers, and what I am going to do is to show the effect of one photon interacting. What we saw was a Compton scattering. Now what I want to do is to go back, change the parameters, change to the same random number so that we'll see the same thing over again, and check this box which says to include the subsequent photon interactions. And now let's run that one photon again and see what happens. What happens is that at the point where the photon interacted, we had a Compton scattering, and the pale blue photon represents that Compton scattered photon from the second interaction, which then escaped from my phantom. And we now have two electron dots which are shown there, each one in red. There can be a whole series of subsequent interactions before the photon finally escapes from the sample, and I can show that in another example here. What I will have to do is to set my seed. A particularly nice photon to show you had the random number 687522566. And let's see what it does. Look at that. Here we had the primary photon come in. We had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 electrons produced by a whole chain of Compton scatterings before the scattered photon finally left the sample. Notice that the subsequent interactions can actually occur upstream from the primary interaction, that is, between the entrance surface and the location of the first scattering. Secondary photons can also be produced from pair production, and I'll have to show you a sample of that on the screen. I will use 10 million electron volt photons. And I will run one photon, and we see that what happened was that the photon came in, the pair production took place here, this